Texas Lutheran University.
Thank you for joining us today for the first installation of this year's monthly Hettinger lecture. Today we have Dr. Steve Vrooman with us. Stephen S. Vrooman, Ph.D., is a professor of communication studies at Texas Lutheran University. Dr. Vrooman has taught courses on public speaking, research methods, popular culture, and communication technology. He appeared in the documentary film The People vs. George Lucas, spoke at TEDx San Antonio, and is likely to be in the upcoming found footage zombie film, Virus of the Dead. He's in the official trailer anyway. He has published articles on popular culture and the rhetoric of the internet. He has presented on diverse topics at numerous conferences around the country. Today's lecture will explore what we can learn about communication and persuasion from games and game design. More and more of education is becoming gamified. This is for a reason, and it is not just because games are fun. Games unlock very particular kinds of interactions between people, and we can unlock some very interesting possibilities by understanding how they work.
Good, right? That's a bad emperor impression, but you know it, right? This is class, isn't it? Like the old, out-of-touch guy who wants to control the galaxy, and like, here's all the students, you know, they're on their phones, right? Like Ghostface over there. This is wind-up sushi. I don't even know what's happening with wind-up sushi, but you know, you get this sense of this is what it's like. You know, this kind of, all these people just can't even. They can't even. They're toys like on plastic, or this guy's foam. I have nothing to say. This is super boring. Just get on with it and take over the galaxy, bud. And you know, I get a sense that that's an awful lot about what communication is often like when we think about how it works. We think about it's often, you know, you're up there or whoever's up there, and you've got this audience who's just kind of passively listening. And our best model for it is that up here, I'm so fascinating, right, that you're just like, yes, you know, but how often does that happen? So what I've been interested in for a couple years now is the ways in which we can sort of tweak that model a little bit and see if there's something we can do to sort of deepen the sort of connection that audiences and speakers have. And I'm especially interested in being able to turn that to the question of education, to the extent that most people spend so many hours in a classroom listening to somebody like me who's super boring, just sort of droning on and on and on. Can we make it more interesting? And that's the idea here, is that what can we learn from toys, from games, and from the ways that we play to make the ways that we work more interesting? So I want to define a couple terms for us, and then I'm going to go on to behind our secret door number 1, 2, 3, and 4. I don't know if you're a let's make a deal kind of person, but in the end, we're going to want to trade everything for door number 4. That's like a spoiler. So I probably shouldn't. Man, I shouldn't even said that. You know, awkward live TV, what are you going to do? Messed it up. Okay, so let's talk about what play and games are. Okay, so play is defined by, and this is with apologies to Johann Huizinga and Gregory Bateson and Mary Flanagan and the other theorists of play. For play is is a kind of a space of escape from real-world consequences. That's when you're playing. Now, of course, there's still conflict, right? Like I could have these people fight each other. You know, I could have Bert, you know, take on the Wampa, because totally, you know, but there's an escape from the real world. Or you remember playing as a kid, you know, maybe you were fighting and somebody would get, you know, you stab them with a sword and then they just get up a little bit. They have to lay down for a little while because that's the rules, like I've been slain. Okay, I'm better now, you know, that's how it works. It's an escape from real world consequences. And so even on certain like reality shows like Survivor, the idea is I'm lying to you right now, but it's a game, so it's fine. You know, you shouldn't be able to hold me accountable in real life for the decisions I make in a game, or like in poker. Does it make me a liar to bluff? That sort of thing. So play tends to have this idea that you're escaping from the real world. Now a game, and I already sort of went there with poker, a game is a play experience, but has meaningful choices. Okay, meaningful choices in a rule-based structure. So in play, your choices don't always have meaning. You know, if I pick up Indiana Jones and like his leg falls off because he's old, I'm like, you know, I mean, if I'm playing, I could just be like, what happened to my leg? I don't know. You know, that's my version of a little play voice. It's been a while. I don't know. But in a game, those choices have meaning. There's rules about what happens when Indiana Jones' leg falls off. So imagine you're playing Jenga. There's a rule, you know, but you have meaningful choices. Meaningful choices is the different part. Meaningful choices, I mean, it seems obvious in some ways, but it isn't always. You know, think about making a choice, whether it's in a silly situation or a serious situation. It's meaningful if how you do what you do has an implication of some kind. Now, this is outside the real world. It has an implication. We'll talk more about that. And then last, I'm going to call another category of things whoppers. Not like the burger, but like if you've seen war games, a whopper is the computer that learns how not to, spoiler alert again, it learns from tic-tac-toe that global thermonuclear war will have no winner. And so it learns itself that this game, which has no point, helps it understand that it should stop trying to nuke Russia, for example. And so I'm calling these whoppers. And these are games now that circle all the way back to the real world. And we begin to learn things about the real world from the game experiences. So play gets us out of the real world. Game puts a structure on that and lets us make choices. And critical gaming, or whoppers, push us forward into this place where we can then take those games and do something with them. OK, now that being said, it's our job to explore some of these games as we talk through a little bit about what that might mean. So here we go, the big reveal. Like, wow, look at this, all kinds of stuff. OK, so these are simple games. These are super simple games. Like War. You played War, right? You know War, where you, I got a big card. You don't? Nah, oh no. Not so good, right? OK, so I'm going to clear some space here so we can set them down. You can take a look. I got to move these guys out of the way. They're going to go have boring class over there somewhere. But all these things are simple, right? Like, for example, in these simple games, like for kid, you remember this from the Game of Life, that game where you put all your kids in the car and you get paid for them at the end? Like, how far did I go? I don't know. It's luck. Same thing in life. You get assigned a salary, and you don't get any choices over it. It's completely luck. So these things aren't very important to us. Tic-tac-toe, it's always a tie, right? It is always a tie. It doesn't matter where you pick as long as people know what's going on. So there's not even any luck. So what do we define simple games as? These are simple games that don't have meaningful choices, in other words. Remember, we talked about the differences. Meaningful choices matter. But these games, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do. You're not making any choices. Dice of different kinds. Dice of different kinds, you roll them, and who knows what you get? In that game, that's zombie dice. I just ate 2 brains, right? Well, it could have been something else. You're not making a meaningful choice. So according to sort of the way we think about game design, there are 3 different elements in a game. There's what we call twitch skills, luck, and strategy. A twitch skill is like what we've demonstrated, physical skill using twitch-based muscles. So this is kind of like Jenga, except you have to stack them on top of their colors. Well, if I mess it up, here we go. That's how I lose. That's how I win. There's nothing intellectual or meaningful about that, and so we get bored of those games really quickly. As a kid, you might like them, but eventually you get bored. And these games have all sorts of stuff. You got Hungry Hungry Hippos. You remember this, right? I was sure I had a strategy when I was a kid. Like, if you did it this way, no, it's not a thing. So luck and twitch, when you put those together, make really, really basic games. And in the end, they're not that interesting to us. And even some games that we think are cool and require strategy, like Monopoly, right? You remember Monopoly? OK, I'm making a deal with you. It's a little bit more strategy, but at the same time, if I only ever land on utilities, what am I going to do? I'm going to do nothing. I got nothing going for me. Other games are very similar. Uno, yeah, there's strategy, but hardly any. Battleship, I know you have a system, but seriously, it's not really. Forget it. And most card games. So when you take all these things together, this is what a lot of us think about games as, especially from a kid perspective. And the idea that we could learn something about communication from those kind of activities seems bizarre. So we're going to move on, though. We're going to move on and begin to talk about games that have strategy. And so this is where we're really going to learn something, I hope, maybe. We'll find out. These 2 doors here in the middle, door number 2 and door number 3, are both games of strategies, but they're different elements, and those different elements are going to help us with something. So before I open that door, one of the important things I've learned over the years from things called the ELM and HSM model. I could spell those out, but I've only got so much time. And if you've been in my class, you've heard those before. They're models of persuasion based on advertising that talk about various channels of communication. One is the central, like I'm looking right at you awkwardly right now. Right? And that means you're thinking about what I'm saying. The others are peripheral, where you're like, ooh, man, he's got cat suspenders. He wins. Yes, I do. I win. Cat suspenders. OK, so if you're impressed with the cat suspenders, as why wouldn't you be, that's peripheral kind of persuasion. Like, you're into that. You kind of think that's cool. But that doesn't mean, I can sell you life insurance right now. I want you to maybe think about life insurance. I don't know why I picked life insurance. It just sounded like something super serious that adults, unlike me, do, I guess. It's kind of boring. Sorry, maybe not. Anyway, those different routes of persuasion are important there. And when you think about that, one of the things that we found over the years is that the key to persuasion is not always what we do. A lot of us think if I just keep it simple and you can understand it, and if I just break it down, you'll understand. But the thing is, simplicity is boring. Imagine a PowerPoint full of bullets. Boring. As David Carson, the designer, says, don't mistake legibility for communication. Just because I can read it doesn't mean I want to. What we want is complexity. Think about narratives. Think about complicated stories. Think about all the stuff we do for entertainment. All that is complicated. Even if it's predictable, like the latest rom-com or action movie, it's still we get involved because it's complicated and it's not easy. So a balance between simplicity and complexity is what's important. So what we've got here are games that are more on the simple side, games that are on the complex side, and we're going to find out what happens. Now, we think about approaching this sort of question of communication and education. It's a sense of, can we learn something from this balance of simplicity and complexity as we figure out what it is, we're going to do next. Speaking of simple, that's Kristen Stewart's facial expression. And I have Twilight the game. You know, as long as we're at it, I'm going to read some of the cards. Are you ready? We got the cards here. Edward's eyes are golden. Without looking, name the eye color of the person to your left. If you're correct, you complete the challenge. There's a guy over there with a camera. His eyes are brown. Bella and Edward stare into each other's eyes a lot. Turn to the player on your left for a staring contest. If your opponent blinks before you, you complete the challenge. I'm out. Twilight. I'm going to put this over here. All right, so these are simple. That game is simple. I pick up a card and stare at you, right? A lot of these are simple kind of games. And so as you look here, you know some of these games and not others. You know, Blockus has some strategy. If you've played Blockus before, you take these pieces and you have to build a chain of them and other people fight you. And that's okay, you know. That has some complexity to it. Here's another game you may not be familiar with. This is story cubes. I roll them, and it's sort of luck, but I have to build stories, and we do this sort of in a group or competitively based on what I roll. So I'm going to roll. This is like totally improv, and I don't know if I'm capable of this. So we got a lightning bolt, a magnifying glass, an arrow, and a flower. So I'm saying one day Harry Potter was investigating Neville's, turnips, and all of a sudden this bow and arrow thing flies out of nowhere. It's Katniss. OMG fanfic. I don't know if that was that a good, you can tell me on the comments if that was a good story. I don't know if it is, but so there's some strategy here, but not a lot. This game here is Pit. You have to sort of negotiate for issues, like you're trying to bargain. Well, there's still a lot of luck. There's some strategy, but in the end it's so fast you can't even compete. So at this level, we're talking about really making it simple for people. And these are a lot of games that people would find fun who don't really like games because they allow you to feel like you're connected in, And if you end down here, you've all played Apples to Apples. You probably played Cards Against Humanity because you're a bad person. But they're very similar games. There's a social game. I've got some stuff, and I connect it together, and we see what's going on. Dixit here is a little more complex than Apples to Apples because unlike the traditional Apples to Apples where you're trying to connect up with something that's dirty, and we've got all these different things. I don't know. I probably shouldn't have picked those. In Dixit, you're connecting up images. Okay, so maybe, is that more strategic, lesser strategic? Remember what a game is, meaningful choices. And what often happens in Apples to Apples, I'm just going to talk about that because that's what most people know about. You've got a card like Vacations, and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm going to throw it away this time, And there's a lot of times in this game where you're not making meaningful choices. Now think about that in terms of sitting in class. How often are you having meaningful thoughts about the content? How often are you, as an audience member, making a meaningful choice about something? Or how often are you hanging out, while the emperor sort of drones on and on? He's talking, he's telling you what to do, write this down, it's going to be on the exam, you're going to write a paper, and you're like, you just want to go to lunch, right? You don't care as much about it. And so part of the reason why things are boring is that you're not making meaningful choices. So what if we could take some of these lessons and say, all right, people are used to simplicity. They're used to not having to think when they're in class, when they're in an audience, when they're trying to absorb information. You back there on the other side of the webinar, right? How do we know that we can't push just a little bit more? These things exist. And eventually we stop playing Hungry Hungry Hippos and we move on to these things as we get older, which means we can do things that are more complicated. Let's find out what kinds. All right, let's move on to a few more complicated things and see what we got going for us here. All right, so this is going to be door number 3. And there's no Twilight behind this door, because those are vampires. They're kind of scary. See, I told you, that's just kind of boring. It's very simple. These are much more strategic kinds of games, where all of a sudden now we're talking about far more complexity. Flux, for example, is a game where you make up the rules as you go along. And you change the rules strategically to try to sort of, combat the others. It reminds me of being a kid and arguing over the rules. Werewolf, which seems really, really, really simple. Those are story cubes. Those should have been in the other pile. Another mistake. We'll get rid of that later in the final edit. Or will we? I don't know. I don't think so. Then we'd lose this joke. And this joke is a quality joke that can't be replicated under other circumstances. And you, particularly, are happy for that joke. This is Werewolf. In Werewolf, you get one card. You ever played Werewolf? If you're in my classes, you played Werewolf. You're either, wait for it, a werewolf, right? Or you're a villager. Or you're some magic person. And anyway, you have one card and you're basically negotiating with each other to see, hey, am I going to eat you at night? Because everybody goes to sleep and then the werewolves come out and eat people. And so you have to figure out who it is and you all lie to each other. See, it's much more complex. Or monster cards, right? Which is like Pictionary, except afterwards, you can't just draw awesome pictures like these, right? Instead, you have to then argue. This is the Donald Trump the cat, weird game. I have to argue with everybody why my picture is better than yours. And if I can argue correctly, then I win. Unlike regular Pictionary, which is I'm just getting my team to guess. So the difference there of simplicity and complexity is regular Pictionary, it's simply denotative. What is this? Whereas when you get to monster cards, it's okay, how do we now persuasively interpret what it is that's going on? And you get down to these games, and there's all kinds of things happening. You get games like Dominion here, where you're building your own deck of cards to sort of fight somebody else, very similar to Magic the Gathering if you're a nerd and you've played that game. Race for the Galaxy, these are the rules, right? This is what you begin to think about, right? Here's our rules. And you're like, oh yeah, clearly 3 brown hexagons gives you that. Whereas the red plus 3 is a total, see, as some of you are like, God, this is why I don't play games, right? Because this is way more complicated. And so what we're dealing with from here to here is the question of how much complexity can we handle? And the thing is that I'm going to say is that we have an answer to those kinds of questions. People know, they self-select. Like maybe you play Ticket to Ride, which I had a colleague once who called it like Candyland for adults, because it's a lot of luck. You don't know what kind of train colors you're going to get. And other people like to play games like Kalis because you've got all these little pieces that you're working with. I got all this stuff. And it means, and you're competing for resources and you're building houses and you're doing all this stuff. And people like that level of complexity. It feels like, again, they're making meaningful choices. Because games like these really thrive on the idea, these are what are called Euro games. There's multiple ways to win. Whereas Monopoly, there was one way to win. You thought that the railroads would help you win. You were totally wrong. That's not a thing. In this case, there's authentically multiple ways to win. And so part of the complexity of the game is figuring out which way to go. You may have heard of Settlers of Catan. That sort of begins this wave where you can either build a lot of roads or build a lot of armies. There's really 2 ways to do it. And these games are like that as well. So maybe you live here. We're going to put you here. This is you. You live there. Look, it's like suspenders, but those are overalls, sorry. But anyway, that's where you are. And you're like, I don't know, sometimes I just want to keep it relaxed. Sometimes I want to be more complicated. Well, this is you. This is you in an audience too, right? I mean, sometimes you're like, I just want you to explain it to me because I just don't have the energy today. And other times you're like, I'm so bored. I just want to do something cool here. How come this class is never cool like Dr. Vrooman's class? Good question. I don't know. And so when you think about this sort of morphing of simplicity to complexity and how you decide in any individual moment what you can engage people in, we end up in an interesting realm. We enter in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons, where all of us together can be so interested in making things up that we can play for weeks and weeks and months and even years in some cases in a world of our own creation that is entirely based on sort of narrative complexity. So what keeps people playing Dungeons and Dragons but not listening in class? It's not that they're not capable of understanding complex things. It's that there are only certain kinds of complexity that are really, triggering their interest and their imagination. So if we think about school, as often, let's keep it simple. Let's keep it really simple. Uno. Very simple. Instead, though, what people kind of want is this. Maybe we're not paying attention not because we can't, but because we don't want to. And so this is the realm where we begin to see people using games in educational experiences, where people are playing games in class to teach things. And that's really where we end up behind door number 4, which these are the whoppers, right? If you remember those, that's from the computer and war games. That was 17 minutes ago we talked about that. I don't know, so we'll see if we're keeping it simple or if we're keeping it complex. And these are games that are critical. These are games that allow us to think further about what's going on. Let me give you some examples before we go behind the door, right? I'm creating suspense now. You're like, what's behind the door? See, I'm not telling you yet. Ha, see? Now you want to know. Complexity, I don't know, maybe not. You guys are like, Vrooman, that's not complexity. And we're going to get you with the questions to find out later. Some examples. Victorian society had fairly strict gender roles. It's one of the first times that people played with dolls in sort of groups in really sort of sort of industrially produced dolls. Industrially produced dolls as opposed to something you would make or your grandmother would make. And these dolls reflected gender norms, which if you imagine Victorian society, not the most feminist time, right? And so these dolls were played with in all sorts of ways. But there's lots of evidence of girls dismembering their dolls, having doll funerals, like at Meet Me in St. Louis where she used to have 4 fatal diseases. And so what is this? This is critical play. These are little girls playing with their dolls and breaking what the dolls are supposed to do, sometimes literally breaking the dolls. I'm not going to demonstrate on my toys because those are collector's items, even though they're out of the packages. Still, I'm not going to do that. But that's critical play. They're playing, but they're pushing it further and coming back to society. There are other examples of this. There's a recent game called Play With Me. It's a computer game where you're having a tea party with a doll. And you have to tell the doll what to do. And so you're like, pour tea. And the doll instead breaks a cup and starts sawing her arm off. And no matter what you do, the doll does something horrible to murder herself. And you keep trying to do stuff, and all of a sudden she's like stabbing herself, and you're like, stop! And you're like, okay, that's a little intense. But it's an example of a critical play game. It's sort of asking us to think about what dolls represent, what the model of dolls having a tea party represents in terms of femininity, and asking us to do more with it. And users do this all the time. I don't know if you've played Sims or Sims 2, but there's a mod, there's probably many. One is called Serial Killer, where instead of, if you've never played The Sims, you have to sort of imagine you're like this suburban house, like, hey, we go to work, we feed the dog, and we drive a car, and we're going to put art on the walls. And in Serial Killer, you just have to torture and destroy your people, and you get the more points as possible for just murdering your players, your characters in different ways, which is, all of these things sound horrible and gross. You're like, wait a minute, Vrooman, I thought we were going to learn from this. We will. There's other ways to do critical play besides horrible things, but it gives you a sense of what's possible in a game environment. Think about you're playing a game and you're interested in making meaningful choices so much that you're going to break the game, break the things in the game in order to push into a new direction. That's something most of us who are in a communication setting, we would give a lot to be able to get our audiences to care that much. So how do we get there? There's some examples of these. One of the games I play in my class, this is called Star Power. And I'm not supposed to reveal what it is because it kind of messes up the game when you play it, but here we go, spoiler alert. If you're watching a webinar and you're a current student, then you're probably already ready to, you're fine, right? And in Star Power, it's a simulation game where you're trading things, like I have to trade some of these things for your things, and we're trading, and it feels like the kind of game where some people are going to trade really well, and they're going to win. Other people are going to trade badly. And the winners end up in the special table. And the losers end up in the loser table. And it goes like this, except what you don't know is it's been rigged from the beginning. Some people have been given more resources than others. And no matter how hard the poor try, they can never outcompete the rich because they never have access to the same amount of resources. And so the game works based on the players all of a sudden deciding that the game is unfair. And the game is over when the poor decide it's no longer worth playing and they stop playing. Now, that's critical play. That's using a game. In this case, the game itself is designed not for the participants to break the game, but in some ways for the game to break the participants. It has an ideological message about poverty and wealth, and as you play the game, the idea is you experience that. For a lot of people, this message about, what does it mean to have income inequality? It's one thing if you're writing down stuff on a PowerPoint. It's an entirely other thing if, while you're doing that, instead you're experiencing it and you're buying into it and you feel betrayed when it turns out that a system you thought was fair wasn't. And so games can do a lot. And there are places like that in educational settings where that game can teach more than almost anything else can. Another example is reenacting the past. It's a semester-long simulation. We've done some at TOU. Professor Amelia Koford, Debbie Cottrell have done this, where the class simulates a key historical moment in conflict, and they research their roles, and they play their roles, and they get all together and they work on it that way. And that experience is a different sort of thing. And there are many other examples of games used in class purposes to teach things. There's examples of Monopoly that have been changed to reflect income issues and things like that. So we can engineer a game to create that effect. So now let's think about that in terms of other communication situations. How do you create that kind of complexity in such a way that you can drive people to change their minds?
Steve, a question for you finally.
What do we got?
Okay, so assuming games can be a vacuum to break norms and imagination, do our actions in the game world have ethical implications even though they aren't attached, like in the poor game you just mentioned, Star Power?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because there were groups who played Star Power who would get upset with each other afterwards. It would change relationships a little bit because, like, I can't believe you didn't treat me that way. And there were students who would, actually, that was one of the mechanisms for people to begin breaking the game early, is if you had a really good friend who was down on the poor side, what could happen is sometimes people in the rich side would try to do their own, like, I'm the hero of the poor, and try to redistribute wealth, and then other people would stop them from doing it. But it was that personal relationship that allowed them to do that. And so I feel like if that moment didn't happen, people would judge you and be upset. Once you get in the critical play world or in the strategy world, I think it matters. Like if you cheat at these games, it bothers people. These games take like 4 hours, some of these. And if you've been cheating the whole time, I feel like I've just been betrayed horribly by you because you violated the nature, because you've taken away my meaningful choices. So I think that there is an ethical connection once the games get this high. That doesn't mean that you're a bad person for lying in poker, but it means maybe how you lie in poker would be different, right? So if we're bluffing, it's one thing to bluff. It's another thing to, like, I swear upon the grave, right? That's a whole different sort of level of issue. Or like, hey, you remember that time, that thing you told me in confidence 23 years ago? That moment? Totally. This is, you're playing on that all of a sudden becomes sort of an issue. So I think that there are ethical implications, and the idea is that as we move down the table, we get to a place where the games, again, are circling back to negotiate the real world, and it's inevitable that would do so. So that's an interesting question.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
What does that say about our situational ethics ability? This is from Drew Brandt, if you remember him.
Yeah, I don't know, Drew, because I think at one hand it means that we clearly do have situational ethics, because I think that there's a level at which, okay, sometimes I'm playing now, therefore it's okay that I do what I do. Or if Drew and I are arguing on Facebook, as we do, like, is this just an argument on Facebook, or are we just having fun, or is this sort of serious, and does this mean something about us when we get to the end of the relationship? And I think there's a huge amount of human life where those things sort of overlap. But I would want to say that I feel like games are foregrounding the problem of situational ethics in a way that other kinds of communication don't. And so I think it helps to train people to figure out what their ethical boundaries are. Like in Star Power, is it, because when you violate the game in Star Power and break it, you have to actually stop doing what the teacher says. You have to actively get together and stop. And that's an ethical decision about whether or not you should do what the teacher says that some students are not prepared to evaluate. It's like, I'm in class, therefore I go to class, and therefore I do what they say. And like the green eyes, blue eyes simulation that I forget the name of the teacher who did it back in the 60s, where she was exploring racism, is a good example of that. I mean, at what point do you feel compelled to connect? So I think that it means that we do have a huge amount of situational ethics, and we often resist the idea of formal ethics because we just want to not be held responsible and just be situational. But I think sometimes we can put those into play in different kind of ways. All right, cool. We got more. They just give me a hard time now. I can feel it. I'm going to bring Bella back if it gets too tough here. All right. So last thing we did before the questions was the question of reacting to the past. And if you think about the situational ethics with that, if you're playing, a Puritan and it's your job to oppress people in the simulation, how do you decide whether or not to continue oppressing people? Do you break character because it's bad that they did that, or do you keep going so that the class can learn? I think that's an interesting moment. So if you think, again, What is it that you want people to do when you're trying to persuade them, or when you're connecting with them and you're teaching them? How much invested in the outcome of that do you want? And I think everybody's answer always is more investment. Whether you're, speaking, whether you're writing, whether you're doing social media, whether you're doing one of these webinars. I mean, the thing that you want is for people to be actively thinking about what it is you're doing and making their decisions so that the learning sticks. If your audience is not making meaningful decisions about what you're saying, they're not remembering. And so we're, again, pushing the edge of complexity when we think about simplicity versus complexity, but at the same time, what could you get out of that complexity if you push it in another direction? So let's look at a couple other games, and then we're almost finished, and then we're going to transition into thinking about, are there things we can learn from these games in a non-game environment to talk about communication? So here's a bunch of games here, and I'm not going to bring all the pieces of these out, but you can see the complexity of it if you want to see all the Japanese war forces from Axis and Allies, which takes hours and hours and hours to do. When you play Axis and Allies, which is a World War II simulation, and you play Japan, you have to decide whether or not you, regardless of history, will do an unplanned attack without declaring war first. And it has serious implications for the course of the game when you make that decision. And this goes back to what Drew was asking in a different sort of way. Does it matter if you play as Japan and you attacked unprovoked? Does that say something about you as a player? Because you could choose another way, and you could even win another way. Especially if you've played 10 times and you know how to win. What does it mean that you made that ethical choice? And I think that's interesting. You get a game here like Puerto Rico, you're a colonizer. You're building farms. You're building coffee plantations and deciding how to place workers on the plantation. This game wasn't intended to be a critical game, but when I've played this with classes before, it doesn't take long for people to find out that all the little pieces that you put on your plantation are colored brown. And you're like, wait. Right? Now that moment is kind of a priceless moment for an educator, to have that bit happen. More prosaically, Seven Wonders. In Seven Wonders, you're building things. You're building the pyramids at Giza, you're building Halicarnassus, and you're trading cards with each other. And you're deciding what you're going to go for and what you're not. And the thing that you would learn from this game, just to highlight here, is you would learn whether or not science is the best way for your society to progress, complex industry, basic industry, warfare, trade. What's the most stable way to build a society? Well, you think about, all of history class is about this question at least a little bit, at least the ones that are about society building. And it's asking you to think about those things. Arkham Horror is another of these games that takes forever. Some of you are probably going, yay, Arkham Horror, because it has super nerd fans. And what's great about Arkham Horror is it asks you things. I'm turning around, I'm turning my back to the camera. It has resources, You have money. Oh, it's not working for the camera. You have money. Great. Makes sense. You have health. Makes sense. You have sanity. Wait, what? Right? So in Arkham Horror, the idea is the more you know, the more you have to risk going insane as these monsters destroy you, like this thing with this horrible-looking tongue bit, right? And so that's a very, very different version of how you think about, what's the power of knowledge? Is there some stuff you just shouldn't know? Which is kind of abstract, but if I were to build an experience to try to ask you, is it okay that you stop learning? That would be the game you would play. And the last one I want to talk about is Castle Panic, which looks like it's a kid's game, and it is, but it's so much more complex than that. In Castle Panic, you're all in this castle with these walls. All of you, this is your castle, and you're all collaborating together. And monsters come out of the forest, like goblins. This is the Goblin King, but he doesn't have the sort of Bowie pants on, which is it's probably good for the kids to not have to see that. And the giant boulders come by. And so they all come out of the forest and converge on you. And you have to decide what to do. The thing about Castle Panic is, if the orcs and trolls kill you all, you're all dead and you lose. If you fight them off with knights, with archers, by making the wall bigger, you win. But whereas everyone can lose, only one person can win. So this game is a game of negotiation, where you have to decide how important is it for you to collaborate. Games like Pandemic, if you've played that, everyone just collaborates or everybody dies. But in this game, you have to collaborate a little bit, but at a certain point you have to decide whether or not any self-interest is going to come in. And playing through that experience is pretty fantastically crazy. And it's an interesting revelation. And so this goes all the way back to those questions about what do these games reveal about us, about what we've learned, about where we can go. But if you think about what you imagine a game is, you know, I'm rolling dice and having fun with zombies. I have a bag full of blocks and I'm going to stack them. You know, we don't think about games necessarily over here unless you're a game nerd. You know, like Gabriel over at Black Forest. You know, this is not always what we want to do. It's not always what we think about. But if this activity, which should just be for fun, whatever that means, can lead us towards these kinds of deeper engagements and understanding, and we learn in spite of ourselves, couldn't we do something similar with what we're doing in terms of communication? So to wrap it all up then, I think that persuasion, communication, connection with people in general in public forums requires us to think about this question of complexity over here. Sorry, complexity's over there. And simplicity over here. And decide what's the balance. What are the balance of these two issues when we're sharing information, whether it's a tweet or a lecture? You know, how do we decide? And I don't think we make that decision enough as communicators. And then second, how far can we push this? How far can we push the complexity and the difficulty level and ask more of people than they were willing to give or thought that they were going to be giving in that experience? How can you take people further? I'm losing games. How can you take people further than they thought and have them learn even more than they thought they might get to? And I think that our ambition as communicators is often not big enough, and we could do more if we really wanted to. So instead of being, you know, the emperor ruling the galaxy, I think that we could do something else. And I'm going to grab him because he's my favorite. We could be one of the wild things instead. And there's a wild rumpus happening, you know, involved in this galactic domination. But in the end, you know, everyone still cooperates and hangs from the same tree. You know, in the end, Max learns something about himself and decides not to be a monster to his mom. And I think that we can ask for something different if we try a little bit harder in different kinds of ways. So that's it. Other questions from folks who happen to be lurking on the internet?
Yes, we have one right here. So, which types of degrees in college, like science and math versus humanities, are better at certain types or certain levels of games? Or is there a distinction between any of that?
So like are sciencey kind of people good at certain kind of games and not others? Is that kind of what you're?
More or less.
I would say that of these kinds of games, when I play these, I see people from all over the spectrum playing them. So there's Noah Westerfield, the scourge of gaming in Seguin, who, you know, is fantastic at these games, and he, you know, he was my student. He has a communication degree. And then I know folks, I've played games like this in a room full of physicists, you know, and they're good. So these games really are about patience with detail, interest in analysis. The rule books are huge. It requires you to pay that attention to the detail. So I don't know that it's different based on sort of math and science or STEM versus arts as much as the kind of STEM or the kind of arts that you do. Are you a person who likes to delve or not? And if you have an audience full of people who don't like to delve, who would rather just roll some dice, the goal is how do you sort of push them in that direction. But I know people would want to say that certain kind of people go over here and certain others over here, but I'm just not sure that happens all the time.
Well, Dr. Vrooman, thank you for coming out today for the first installment of the Hettinger Lectures. We have on Thursday, October 13th, Dr. Judith Hoffman will be doing her lecture over Texas population changes and growth. Make sure you guys tune in, and thank you guys for joining.
All right.
For more information, please visit tlu.edu.